fire and the throne. Moscow time 2100. But Moscow was not sleeping tonight. Dublin was not sleeping. London, New York, Istanbul, screens across the world were frozen. Because this was not a diplomatic summit. This was not a sports program. And it certainly was not a political panel. Tonight, two worlds were about to collide. When the heavy doors of the RT International studio opened, the air inside became almost unbreathable. The lights were brighter than usual, the cameras closer than ever, because no one wanted to miss this moment. Two names sat at the table. On one side, Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin. For more than 2 decades, a man who had ruled a nation. Silent, cold, calculating. Less a man than a system, one who silenced with a glance, who terrified through silence. And opposite him, Conor McGregor, not a head of state, not a general, not a diplomat, but for millions of people a living rebellion. The presenter swallowed hard. He knew he could not control this table. Ladies and gentlemen, tonight, for the first time in history, representatives of two entirely different worlds face one another. There was applause, but more than that, there was tension. Putin did not move. His hands rested on the table, fingers interlocked, like a chess grandmaster. McGregor leaned back in his chair, broad shoulders, defiant eyes. This was his stage, even without a cage. Putin speaks. "Mr. McGregor," Putin said. His voice was low, yet he did not strain the microphone. World leadership is not achieved by shouting, by waving fists, by emotions. The world is ruled through discipline, through patience, through strategy. A restrained applause rippled through the studio. Putin continued. "You are entertainment, a spectacle. But history does not remember spectacles, it remembers empires." The cameras turned to McGregor. Silence, the kind of silence that comes before a storm. McGregor's first response. McGregor leaned towards the microphone. "Empires," he said. He smiled. "Empires fall, Vladimir. I've seen it again and again in the ring. Those who look big go down with the first clean shot." A murmur spread across the studio. McGregor continued. "You look down from above. I came from the bottom. You rule with fear. I lead with hope." Putin raised an eyebrow slightly. A rare reaction.
First clash. What is power? Putin. Power means control. McGregor. No. Power means not being afraid. Power is being able to silence people. Power is when no one can silence you. Someone shouted from the audience. Security shifted uneasily, but no one stopped McGregor. Because it was already too late. McGregor strikes. "You force people to their knees," Conor said. "I taught people how to stand." Putin's face remained expressionless, but his eyes hardened. "I fought in a cage," McGregor went on. "You hid in palaces." That sentence hit the studio like a bomb. The presenter tried to intervene. Putin raised his hand. He wanted him to continue. It was a mistake. The manifesto begins. "Do you know something, Vladimir?" McGregor said. "When people watch you, they fall silent. When they watch me, they shout, because you are fear and I am courage." Social media exploded. Hashtag McGregor versus Putin, hashtag Fire versus Throne trended worldwide. "You protect the past," Conor said. "I force the future." He stood up. At that moment, there was no turning back. When I raise my fists, people feel strong. When you raise your tanks, people run. For the first time, Putin spoke sharply. Enough. But McGregor did not stop. The final blow. "The world no longer wants cowardly leaders," Conor said. "The world wants truth." He pointed at the table. "You represent a throne. I represent the people." And then came the final line. "Thrones collapse, but fire spreads." Silence. Putin did not speak, because this was no longer a debate. This was a KO.
Part 2. When the ice cracks. The applause in the studio slowly faded, but the silence was far more dangerous. Vladimir Putin did not speak for several seconds. That was deliberate. Silence was his oldest weapon. Rather than suffocating his opponent with words, he let them drown in their own echo. The cameras were tight on his face. There was not the slightest trace of anger, but his eyes, they were no longer cold. They had sharpened. He drew the microphone closer. "Mr. McGregor," he said calmly, "you shout because you have nothing else." A low murmur rippled through the studio. "I do not shout. I produce results. Countries do not survive by shouting. Countries live through discipline." Putin leaned back in his chair. "You are a moment. I am an era." That sentence was a challenge, not the words of a statesman, but of an emperor. Putin's counterattack, the system. "You claim to give people hope," Putin said, "but hope is disorder. Hope is lack of control. I provide order." Some faces in the studio nodded. The words were familiar, terrifying, yet familiar. "People say they want freedom, but freedom is chaos. Chaos brings blood. I stopped the blood." For the first time, Putin looked directly into McGregor's eyes. "You speak of fire. Fire burns. I bring ice. Ice preserves." The metaphor landed heavily and dangerously. The presenter held his breath, because this was no longer directed only at Conor, but at everyone watching. Conor McGregor lowered his head. He let out a short laugh. "Ice?" he said. "Yes, I know it very well." He leaned closer to the microphone. "Ice, Vladimir, preserves everything that is lifeless, but it kills everything that is alive." Someone in the studio whispered, "Bloody hell." McGregor did not stand this time. He was striking from his seat. "You call it order. I call it frozen fear." Putin's lips tightened into a thin line.
The psychological fracture.
"You say people shout when they look at me," McGregor continued. "Yes, because for the first time they feel heard." He tapped the table lightly with his finger. 1, 2, 3. "In your country, people whisper, Vladimir. My audience shouts. That's the difference." The air in the studio changed. This was no longer an insult. It was a diagnosis. "You love order," he went on, "because in disorder you lose control. I love chaos, because that's where real faces are revealed." Putin's patience is wearing thin. Putin leaned into the microphone more firmly. "You see the world far too simply,"
he said. "People want a strong hand. They want to be guided. You do not understand this." With that sentence, Putin revealed his cards without realizing it. McGregor's eyes lit up. "That's it," he said. "That's exactly why I'm here." McGregor's cutting reply. "People don't want a strong hand. They want their own hands." A powerful round of applause erupted. "You see people as children. I see them as fighters." He lowered his voice. "You look down on them. I stand beside them." Then came the line, the breaking line of part 2. "You tell people to obey. I tell them to stand up." At that moment, social media exploded. Hashtag stand up, not obey. Hashtag fire against ICE shot to the top. Putin played his final card, history. Putin took a deep breath. "Young man," he said, "history has seen many men like you. All of them were temporary." He tilted his head slightly. "I am still here." It was a clear threat, and at the same time a confession. McGregor did not blink. McGregor's answer to history. "History," he said. "Yes, I know history very well too." His tone changed, calmer, heavier. "History does not remember those who sit on the throne for a long time. It remembers those who shake it." For the first time, a microscopic tension appeared on Putin's face. "You'll be a paragraph in history," McGregor said. "I'll be a headline." The studio was utterly silent. End of part 2, suspended. The presenter tried to step in. "Please," but Putin raised his hand. He wanted to speak. At that exact moment, the camera zoomed in on McGregor's face. His eyes were calm, because he knew the ice had cracked. And in the next chapter, when the water began to rise, no one would be able to swim.
Part 3. The State and the Individual. No one in the studio was comfortable anymore. It was a rare sensation for television. The audience was no longer merely watching, they were bearing witness. Vladimir Putin straightened up. His shoulders tightened. It was a posture millions had known for years, the posture of the state. "Mr. McGregor," he said, "you constantly speak of the individual. But individuals come and go. The state remains." That sentence split the room in two. Some applauded, others shifted uneasily in their seats. "The individual makes mistakes," Putin continued. "The state corrects them. The individual is emotional. The state is rational." He lifted his chin slightly. "I do not govern individuals. I govern the system." This was his strongest argument, and perhaps his most dangerous. The language of the state. "You believe you are a symbol," Putin said, "but symbols, when left uncontrolled, turn into chaos." His voice was now clearer, sharper. "The state limits the individual, because without limits there is destruction." These words were engraving themselves into the minds of millions watching at home. The presenter had stopped taking notes. This was no longer a program where questions were asked. Conor McGregor paused for several seconds before replying. It was deliberate. Then he spoke. "The individual makes mistakes," he said. "That's true." A brief pause. "But when the state makes a mistake, who corrects it?" The studio froze. McGregor continued. "A state's mistake is written on gravestones. An individual's mistake becomes a lesson." Putin narrowed his eyes. "What the state fears."
You talk about systems, McGregor said. I'm talking about spirit. He pointed to his chest. The state has no spirit, Vladimir. The state is afraid. That's why it controls. A murmur spread through the studio. The individual isn't afraid, he went on, because they have nothing left to lose. That sentence stood against everything Putin was defending.
That's romanticism, Putin said. The real world doesn't work like that. But his voice, for the first time, it cracked slightly. Without the state, there is chaos. With chaos comes blood. Putin struck the table lightly with his fist. I stopped the bloodshed. This was a defense, and for the first time, Putin was the one defending. McGregor's quietest blow. Conor shook his head. No, he said calmly, you didn't stop the blood. Breaths were held across the studio. You only turned down the sound of it. The sentence landed like a slap. McGregor continued, when people cannot speak, blood speaks. The manifesto of the individual. The individual makes mistakes, but the individual learns. He didn't stand up, but his voice did. The state makes mistakes and then denies them. A sharp tension crossed Putin's face. You sanctify the power of the state, McGregor said. I sanctify the power of the human being. He pointed directly at Putin, and history does not remember sanctified power, it remembers challenged power. The cameras captured the turning point. The director cut from McGregor's face to Putin's. Putin was no longer expressionless, his jaw was clenched. For a man built on control, this was the most dangerous moment. Putin's final defense. People applaud men like you, Putin said, but in the end they return to me because I am order. It was an old belief. McGregor smiled. McGregor's counter-belief. People don't return to you, he said. They only fall silent when they have nowhere left to run. He lowered his voice. I don't represent the silent. I represent those who speak. Applause erupted, but this time it was darker, deeper. As part 3 ends, the presenter finally found his voice. Let's take a break. But Putin stood up. That wasn't planned, and McGregor slowly rose as well. 2 men, 2 worlds. The camera framed them together, and everyone felt it. In the next chapter, words would no longer be enough.
Part 4. Power, Fear, and Legitimacy. Both men were standing. It was a rare moment in television history, because this was no longer a discussion, it was a confrontation. The studio lights felt harsher, the cameras were closer, the control room barely breathed. For the first time, Vladimir Putin turned directly towards McGregor. His tone had changed, not louder, sharper. Power, he said, does not come from applause. Not a sound in the studio. Power, he continued, comes from authority, from legitimate authority. He emphasized the word deliberately, legitimate. My power comes from elections, from institutions, from the state. Putin took a step forward. Your power comes from crowds. Crowds disperse. The state remains. That sentence was delivered to millions at home like a cold, unyielding truth. The language of authority. People want leaders, Putin said, not noise. He fixed his gaze. And leadership is not about pleasing everyone. Sometimes fear is necessary. The word echoed in the studio. Fear. Putin did not retreat. I was never afraid of being feared, because fear preserves order. Some faces flinched, others nodded. These words were a confession. McGregor's slow response. Conor McGregor did not answer immediately. This silence was heavier than all the ones before. Then he spoke. "Yes," he said, "people want leaders." He nodded. "But not leaders they are afraid of." A ripple moved through the room.
Legitimacy begins to fracture. "You talk about legitimacy," McGregor said. "Let me ask you something." He stepped forward. "Is a leader legitimate because people are silent or because they are allowed to speak?" Putin's brow tightened slightly. "You say your power comes from the ballot box," Conor continued. "But when the ballot box is surrounded by fear, that power is not legitimate." That sentence was the heaviest to land in the studio so far. "The difference between fear and respect," Putin replied sharply. "Respect comes from fear." McGregor seized it instantly. "No," he said. "Obedience comes from fear. Respect never does." He lowered his voice. "An obedient people turn their backs at the first opportunity." A deep murmur rolled through the studio. "A respected leader," he went on, "is not spoken about in whispers. They whisper about you, Vladimir." For the first time, open anger crossed Putin's face. "The source of legitimacy. My power comes from the crowd," McGregor said. "Yes," he smiled, "because the crowd chose me." Putin tried to interrupt. McGregor raised his hand. "No, let me finish." It was a cage moment. "The crowd applauded me," he said, "but before that they tested me." He pointed to his chest. "I lost. I fell. I was beaten." His voice hardened. "And they still came back because I didn't hide." "Power," Putin said, "does not show weakness." This time his voice rose. McGregor replied instantly. "That's why you're alone." The studio felt electrically charged. "A leader who hides his weakness," Conor said, "is not strong. He's afraid." He chose the word deliberately. "You don't want people to love you," McGregor said. "You want them to fear you." Putin snapped back. "Because fear is loyal." McGregor shook his head. "No," he said. "Fear is impatient." He took another step forward. "Fear runs at the first crack." The presenter tried to speak. No one listened. The control room considered cutting the broadcast, but it couldn't, because the world was watching. "My legitimacy," Conor said, "comes from my flaws." Silence. "Because a flawed person is real." He looked at Putin. "You try to look flawless. That's why no one can touch you." He lowered his voice. "They touched me, and I'm still standing." As part 4 ends, Putin paused for a moment. He did not speak. For him, that was rare. McGregor did not step back. Between the two men now, there was no longer just a table. There were 2 worldviews. And everyone knew. In the next chapter, the final great question would be asked. Who represents a country? The throne or the people?
Part 5. The people, the leader, and the final confrontation. It felt as if hours had passed in the studio, yet no one was looking at the clock. Because time no longer mattered. The moment did. Both men were still standing. The table between them was no longer furniture, but a boundary line. Vladimir Putin leaned towards the microphone. He deliberately slowed his voice. It was an attempt to regain control. "Mr. McGregor," he said, "you constantly speak of the people." A brief pause.
The people do not always know what they want. A cold wind swept through the studio. The people are impulsive, he continued, emotional. They applaud today and forget tomorrow. Putin narrowed his eyes. Leadership is not doing everything the people demand. Leadership is deciding on their behalf. With that sentence, Putin revealed himself more clearly than ever. I know better for you. I know my people, Putin said, their weaknesses, their fears. His tone was cold. Sometimes people do not know what is good for them. These words sparked anger across countless screens. But Putin did not stop. That is why leaders exist, he said, to guide. McGregor took a deep breath. He did not raise his voice. If anything, he softened it. That, he said, is exactly why you will never represent the people. Not a sound in the studio. Because when you speak about the people, you speak down to them. Putin's face tightened. Who are the people? The people, McGregor said, are not a mass to be managed as you imagine. He pointed to the floor. The people are the man who wakes up at 5 in the morning, the mother who sends her child to school, the person living with debt yet still finding a way to smile. His voice hardened slightly. The people are not something for you to control through fear.
The definition of leadership collapses. You think leadership, McGregor said, means looking down. He shook his head. I learned leadership as standing at the same level. Putin tried to interrupt. McGregor continued. When I was in the ring, he said, I was level with the crowd. I was sweating. I was bleeding. He locked eyes with Putin. You've never bled, Vladimir. That's why you can't understand the people. The words echoed heavily through the studio. Putin attacks one last time. Romantic nonsense, Putin snapped. His voice was no longer controlled. A country is not run on emotions. It was his first open outburst of anger. McGregor did not retreat. True, Conor said, a country cannot be governed by emotions alone. A short pause, but it cannot be governed without them either. A deep breath was drawn across the studio. People may obey you, he said, but they trust me. Putin shook his head. Trust is weakness. McGregor replied instantly, no, trust takes courage. The people's decision. You decide on behalf of the people, McGregor said. I allow the people to decide. That sentence was the heart of the chapter. You speak from above, he continued. I speak from among them. He lowered his voice, and people believe the voice that comes from within them. The studio slipped beyond control. Applause began, but this time it was uneven, natural. The presenter could not speak. The control room did not cut the feed, because this moment could not be cut. Putin's silence. Vladimir Putin did not reply. This was the first true silence of the entire program. He turned his head slightly, lowered the microphone. It was not an admission, but it was an ending. McGregor's closing line. A leader, he said, is not someone who walks in front of people, he paused, but someone who walks beside them. He placed the microphone on the table. As part 5 ends, the studio was on its feet, but not shouting, in quiet awareness, and the world understood this. This was not about winning or losing. It was about which voice would represent the future.
Part VI. Who will history remember? Final. No one in the studio was speaking. There was no applause, no boos, only thought. That was something rarely seen on television. People usually shout, take sides and leave, but this time everyone stayed exactly where they were. Vladimir Putin was looking at the microphone, but he was not reaching for it. Conor McGregor was still standing, silent. Yet it was not the silence of victory, it was the weight of a final word. The presenter cleared his throat, his voice trembled. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have reached the end of the program." No one moved. "I would like to ask for your final words." That question was not addressed to two men, but to two versions of history. Putin's final word: stone. Vladimir Putin finally reached for the microphone. His voice was under control again, but it was no longer the same. "I," he said, "represent stability." He spoke briefly, as always. History remembers those who provide stability. A pause. Not those who create chaos. He set the microphone down. That was it. It was not a conclusion. It was a wall.
Final word: fire. Conor McGregor nodded. He stepped slowly towards the microphone. He did not raise his voice. There was no ring now, no crowd, only people. "Stability," he said, "is what stays in place." He looked at Putin, not with hostility, almost with sadness. History does not remember those who stay still. He paused. It remembers those who move. Breaths were held across the studio. Brain, history's true memory. "History," McGregor continued, "does not ask how long you sat on the throne." He lowered his voice. "History asks this: did people fall silent because of you, or did they speak because of you?" That question was now aimed at millions watching at home. "I'm not perfect," he said. "I never was." He smiled. "But I didn't hide." Blood, the final manifesto. "You leave order behind," he said, looking at Putin. "I leave a mark." He stepped back slightly. "Order changes one day." He did not harden his voice. He softened it. But a mark stays inside people. Some in the studio looked away. Others lowered their heads. Fire, the final line, KO. "One day," McGregor said, "your name will remain in books." He paused. "Mine will live the moment someone says, 'If he did it, maybe I can too.'" He slowly placed the microphone on the table. The studio, final frame. The cameras turned to both men at once. One was silent, cold, motionless. The other tired, flawed, but alive. And in that moment, no one said it out loud, but everyone knew. This was not a debate. This was a vote on what the future should sound like. Epilogue, narrator, YouTube outro. That night, no one officially won, but millions of people felt one thing clearly. Power is not about creating fear. Power is giving someone the courage to stand up. And history does not always choose the quietest throne, nor the loudest voice. History remembers the truest one. Red, closing. If this story made you think, made you uncomfortable, or forced you to choose a side, that wasn't an accident. Subscribe, because here we don't offer easy answers. We ask hard questions. And remember, fire doesn't always burn. Sometimes it simply wakes you up.